Dear friends, in this story, Echoes of the Headless Spirit, we dive into the chilling journey of a lone truck driver traversing a desolate highway under the cover of night. As strange and terrifying encounters unfold, he crosses paths with a headless ghost, an apparition tied to a dark and tragic legend. As the supernatural presence becomes more frequent and relentless, the driver finds himself drawn into a descent of fear and paranoia. With every mile, he unravels a haunting truth about the ghost's vengeful quest. But in the end, a horrifying confrontation awaits, and the driver must face the malevolent spirit in the most terrifying way possible. Let us begin the tale of Echoes of the Headless Spirit. The road stretched endlessly before Jack Callahan, a lone truck driver navigating the dark, desolate highway that cut through the heart of the American Midwest. With the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional rattle of the trailer, the only sound was the rhythmic pounding of tires against asphalt. It was the dead of night, far beyond the typical hours for most drivers. Jack was on another long haul, another solitary stretch of highway to conquer, but tonight felt different. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of unease that Jack couldn't quite shape. For years, Jack had driven these roads, crisscrossing the United States from coast to coast. The life of a trucker was never glamorous, but it was a life Jack knew well. The isolation suited him, a chance to be alone with his thoughts, to escape the noise of the world. But as the miles passed and the truck's headlights carved through the darkness, something felt wrong this time. He couldn't pinpoint it. No sounds, no movement, but there was a sense of waiting, as though something, or someone, was just out of sight, watching from the shadows. So if the highway seemed to go on forever, a winding path through the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but darkness. There were no other vehicles on the road, no signs of life for miles. Just Jack, his truck, and the endless stretch of asphalt leading him farther into the night. The radio crackled in the background, offering only static, as if even the airwaves had decided to abandon him. Jack's eyes drifted to the side mirror, expecting to see only the glow of his own headlights reflecting back. But instead, he saw nothing. Just the pitch-black void of the night. A wave of discomfort passed over him, but he dismissed it. He had driven through worse. The nights when his mind played tricks on him, when the silence seemed too loud and the shadows too deep. It was all part of the job. Still, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The landscape outside had changed. The trees lining the road were sparse now, replaced by stretches of barren, open land. The moonlight flickered weakly in and out of the clouds, casting eerie shadows that danced across the road. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then the moonlight flushed. Jack reached for his thermos, pouring a hot, bitter cup of coffee, trying to shake off the growing tension that seemed to hang in the air. It was a familiar routine, just another night on the road. And yet, the quiet was suffocating. There was no one around, nothing to break the stillness, and Jack couldn't help but feel as though he was being drawn deeper into some unknowable force. A couple of hours later, Jack raised his head and said, "I'm really not feeling well." He wasn't sure how long it had been since he last saw another vehicle, but the solitude was becoming unnerving. Just the road, the truck, and the oppressive dark. What lay ahead, Jack had no idea, but he soon would. And it was something far worse than he could ever have imagined. Jack's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the empty highway ahead. The unease that had been creeping up on him since the first mile had now turned into a gnawing anxiety. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, the only signs of stretch endlessly, the only signs of life being the faint rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional flicker of the headlights cutting through the fog. He had driven this stretch of highway countless times, but something felt different now. Something in the air, something in the silence. A strange heaviness weighed on him, as though the world outside the truck had grown unnaturally still. Jack's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, a habit born from long hours on the road. There was nothing behind him, just the dark abyss of the road extending into the night. Suddenly, a figure caught his attention. It was a flash of movement off to the side of the road. Jack's eyes narrowed, trying to make out what he had seen. For a moment, he thought it was just a trick of the mind, a shadow playing with his tired senses. But no, there it was again. A faint, shadowy form standing just off the shoulder of the highway. Jack's truck barreled forward, the headlights illuminating the figure as he got closer. His heart skipped a beat. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one at first. The figure stood motionless, facing away from the road, their back to Jack's oncoming truck. The shape was tall and slender, wrapped in ragged clothing that fluttered in the wind. As Jack's truck neared the figure, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something about the way the figure stood, unnaturally still, like a mannequin or a statue, set off a wave of alarm. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the sense of wrongness only deepened. Who the hell is out here at this hour? Jack muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the wheel. He was a trucker, used to encountering stranded motorists or hitchhikers, but this felt different. There was an unsettling aura surrounding the figure that sent a chill down his spine. The road was desolate, and anyone out here at this time of night should have been long gone or safely in a truck stop by now. Jack slowed the truck as he approached the figure, his headlights now fully illuminating the form. As the truck drew closer, the truth of the figure's appearance became clear. Jack's stomach lurched, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a person at all. The figure was headless. It was impossible to comprehend at first. The body was there, clothed in tattered rags, but where its head should have been, there was only an empty void. A dark, gaping space. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he stared in disbelief, unable to look away. The apparition stood in the middle of the highway, frozen in place, like a nightmare materialized in the light of his truck's headlights. His foot instinctively pressed harder on the brake, slowing the truck to a crawl as he tried to process the scene in front of him. The figure's body was covered in bloodstains, dark patches that marred the once dressed clothing, the stains spreading across the shoulders and down the torso, as though the person had been injured in some horrific way. The sight was grotesque and made Jack's stomach churn. His mouth went dry and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. Jack's first instinct was to turn around, to drive away from whatever this was. But his eyes remained fixed on the ghostly figure, his mind unable to process the horror in front of him. The truck was nearly parallel to the apparition now, and Jack could see it more clearly. It was standing unnaturally straight, as though it had been frozen in time. The figure's clothes were old, unragged and torn, hanging loosely from its thin, emaciated frame. The wind blew across the empty highway, tugging at the torn clothing, but the figure remained eerily still, as though it were impervious to the elements. Suddenly, the temperature seemed to drop. Jack's breath fogged up in front of him, even with the truck's heater running full blast. A sharp, icy gust of wind blew through the cabin, and the radio, which had been nothing but static for hours, crackled to life with a faint, eerie hum. His hands were shaking now, the grip on the steering wheel tight as he fought the rising panic in his chest. Without thinking, Jack slammed his foot down on the accelerator, tearing away from the figure in a burst of speed. He had to get away. This was insane. There was no way he had seen what he thought he saw. A headless body standing in the middle of nowhere? He must have been hallucinating, right? But even as he pushed the truck faster, even as the headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still with him. In the distance, he glanced in the rearview mirror again. His blood ran cold. The figure was there, standing on the side of the road, watching the truck drive away. But something had changed. The figure hadn't remained still. It had turned its body toward the truck, its ragged clothing swaying with the wind, as though it was watching him leave. Jack's pulse quickened. No, that wasn't possible. He hadn't seen it move. It hadn't even been real. He closed his eyes. He ached everywhere. Then the telephone bell rang, and he rose. But there it was. The image burned into his mind. The headless body, standing motionless by the side of the road, covered in bloodstains, as if it were waiting for him to pass again. I wasn't certain then that I was. I was sure now. Fear gripped Jack's chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He slammed his foot down on the gas pedal even harder, desperate to put miles between him and the apparition. The figure in the rearview mirror faded away, but Jack's mind couldn't let go. What had he seen? Was it real, or was he just too tired? But deep down, Jack knew, he had seen something. He had seen it. And whatever it wasn't done with him yet. The road ahead stretched on, dark and endless. But now, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Something was following him. Something from the night. Something that belonged to a place where nightmares were born. Jack's knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel, trying to calm his racing heart. He had driven hours since his first encounter with the headless apparition, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the ghostly figure would flood his mind. The ragged clothing, the bloodstains, and the empty space where a head should have been. His hands trembled with each turn of the steering wheel, and his eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror. The long stretch of highway seemed endless now, and Jack felt a rising unease, as though something was following him, just out of sight. It was an instinctual feeling, like being watched. His thoughts kept spiraling back to that horrifying sight. Had he imagined it? Was it a product of exhaustion, his mind playing tricks on him? Or was it real? As the night wore on, Jack realized he needed a break. He hadn't stopped since his encounter with the ghost, and the fatigue was starting to wear on him. His eyes were sore, his body stiff from hours of driving. He spotted a truck stop up ahead, a small, dimly lit oasis in the vast expanse of highway. Jack pulled in, eager for a cup of coffee, a stretch of his legs, and maybe, just maybe, a moment of peace. The truck stop was quiet, only a handful of rigs parked around the perimeter. Jack pulled his truck into an empty spot and climbed out, stretching his sore limbs as he walked toward the small diner attached to the station. The smell of greasy food and burnt coffee filled the air. A few truckers sat hunched over their meals, their faces weathered and tired. Jack took a seat at the counter, hoping to blend in and get some much-needed caffeine. A middle-aged man sitting 2 stools down glanced over at Jack. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years on the road. His scruffy beard was flecked with grey, and his eyes were bloodshot. But there was a certain knowing gleam in them, a sharpness Jack couldn't ignore. The man's eyes lingered on Jack for a moment before he gave a slow nod, as if recognizing something in Jack's demeanor. "You look like you've seen something," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jack stiffened, but didn't look away. His instinct was to ignore the comment, but something about the man's tone made him pause. Maybe it was the years of solitude, the loneliness of the road, or maybe it was the overwhelming sense of dread that still clung to him. But Jack decided to answer. I don't know, Jack said, his voice shaky. I'm probably just tired. I saw something on the road tonight. Something that didn't make sense. A figure. No head. The trucker's eyes narrowed slightly, but instead of skepticism, Jack saw something else. Recognition, as though this was a story he had heard before. I figured as much, the trucker muttered under his breath. He glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned closer to Jack, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That'd be the headless ghost. You're not the first to see her. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The man's words struck him like a bolt of lightning. The headless ghost. He had assumed it was just his imagination, but this man... He was talking like he knew exactly what Jack had seen. You've seen her too, Jack asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. The trucker nodded solemnly, his gaze distant, as if lost in thought. Many times, the trucker replied, leaning back in his seat and folding his arms. Been on this highway for years. I've heard all the stories, met a lot of folks who've had their own encounters with her. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to hear something that would change everything he thought he knew about the road he had travelled for so long. Tell me, Jack urged, his voice tight with curiosity and fear. The trucker exhaled slowly, the weight of the story clearly heavy on his mind. It was a long time ago, back when I first started hauling freight. There was a woman, a local who lived not too far from here. I didn't know her personally, but I knew she'd been driving that stretch of road regularly, like a lot of folks around here. One night, she was driving home after a visit to see her sister. Real quiet, no traffic, nothing unusual about the night at all. But for some reason, that night, it was different. Jack leaned in, his attention fixed entirely on the man. The trucker's voice had dropped to a near whisper, as though recounting a dark secret. The road's dangerous up ahead, the trucker continued. There's a sharp curve, real tricky. A lot of trucks wreck there. I've seen some close calls myself. Anyway, this woman, her name was Sarah, I think, was driving around that curve when her car slipped right off the road. The impact was so bad, the car flipped and rolled. The driver's side took the brunt of it. Jack felt a sick knot form in his stomach as he listened. Now here's the thing, the trucker went on, his voice heavy with the gravity of the tale. They never found her head. The rest of her body was recovered, but the head was missing. Vanished. They searched for days. A search party combed through the woods, the ditches, and the fields nearby. Nothing. It was like it just disappeared. Jack's mouth went dry. He could barely process the words, but the trucker wasn't finished. They say Sarah's spirit is trapped here now, searching for what's lost, her head. Every night, she walks that stretch of road, and if you're unlucky enough to come across her, well, you might just become part of her search. That's the legend, anyway. Jack could feel the weight of the trucker's words sinking into his bones. He stared at the man, searching his face for any sign that this was just an old story, a tall tale meant to scare the newcomers. But the trucker's eyes were full of something else. Something Jack couldn't quite name. Fear? Regret? Beyond that wider figure stood the pedestrian couple, muttering to one another. You ever seen her? Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. Speak. The trucker gave a solemn nod. More times than I care to remember. It's always the same. You see her standing by the road, bloodstains on her clothes, no head. And no matter how fast you drive, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and her, she's always there, watching. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he sat in stunned silence. The stories he had heard in passing, the whispers he had dismissed as folklore, were suddenly far too real. Grace alarms herself. "I think we had better retreat." The trucker looked at Jack, his gaze hardening. "If you ever see her again, don't stop. Don't let her get too close. Trust me on that." Jack swallowed, the fear creeping up his spine as the trucker's words echoed in his mind. The headless ghost wasn't just a story, it was real. And now, Jack had become part of it. The road had become Jack's constant companion over the past few weeks. Long stretches of asphalt, empty and desolate, winding through endless miles of nothingness. The truck's engine was the only sound in the silence, humming softly in the background as Jack navigated the night. His eyes, weary from the endless hours of driving, would often drift to the side of the road, a sense of dread lingering in the pit of his stomach. He was always looking, always expecting her, always hoping he wouldn't see her again. But night after night, there she was. Miranda felt hateful that he was working, but he couldn't drag her away from her delight in art. But each day, this painting seemed to deepen. It started innocuously enough, just a flicker at the edge of his vision, something strange in the dark. At first, Jack had brushed it off, chalking it up to the fatigue or the vast emptiness that surrounded him. But as time went on, those fleeting glimpses turned into undeniable sightings as she stood on the shoulder of the road, her tattered form glowing faintly in the truck's headlights, drenched in bloodstains, the space where her head should have been, empty, as though it had been violently torn away. Jack had no idea who or what she was, but he knew one thing. She was real. Her presence, unnerving and impossible to ignore, gnawed at him, creeping into his thoughts, even during the daylight hours. He couldn't shake the image of her lifeless body, standing alone on the side of the road, waiting. The first time he saw her clearly, he swerved the truck, nearly losing control in the process. The shadowy figure had appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road, blocking his path. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded, narrowly missing her. When he looked in the rearview mirror, she was gone, vanished. Just like that. Jack tried to forget about it. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the mind, a mirage conjured by exhaustion, or the empty stretch of highway playing tricks on him. But he knew better. The next night, and the one after that, the encounters grew more frequent, more vivid. Each time he drove through that same stretch of highway, the ghost was waiting. Sometimes she stood motionless on the shoulder. Other times she seemed to glide across the road, her ghostly form flickering in and out of view, her blood-stained clothes barely visible in the darkness. Jack never dared to look for long, but he couldn't help it. He had to know if she was still there. The longer he stared at her, the more her presence seemed to become real, more solid, more terrifying. Then, one night, the encounters grew even worse. As Jack neared the spot where he had seen her countless times before, he braced himself. His grip tightened on the wheel, and his foot hovered nervously above the brake. He tried not to look, but his eyes betrayed him, flicking toward the shoulder. This time, she wasn't waiting there. No. This time, she was standing directly in the middle of the road, blocking his way. And she wasn't just standing still. She was moving. The air grew colder. a chill that crept under Jack's skin and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The moonlight flickered as the truck's headlights swept over her, revealing her form in full. Her body was covered in dark stains, soaked through with blood. The tattered rags of her clothing hung loosely around her, but the absence of her head was what truly horrified Jack. The gaping neck was raw, and the skin around it seemed to pulsate, as if something was desperately trying to reattach itself. His heart raced, and panic set in. He slammed his foot on the gas, speeding up in a futile attempt to get away. But no matter how fast he drove, the ghost seemed to be everywhere. In the rear-view mirror, her figure loomed, always just behind him. And then, in the headlights again, her form flickering like a fading shadow. Jack couldn't escape her. She was following him. That night his eyes barely stayed open, but the road demanded his attention. It was the long hours and the endless miles that dulled his senses, making his mind play tricks on him. Or so he thought. It wasn't until another stretch of highway, another lonely stretch of road, that the ghost made her next appearance. But this time, things were different. Jack had been driving for hours, his body aching from the constant motion, his mind clouded with exhaustion. As he neared the familiar stretch where the ghost had appeared countless times, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. The figure was no longer just standing. This time the ghost was closer. She was right next to him, inside the truck. Louis peered up at the woman. There were tears leaking down her cheeks, some of solid grey, a few sprinkles of mud. Jack blinked in disbelief as his vision swam with confusion. There, sitting beside him in the passenger seat, was the headless woman. Her blood-stained clothes clung to her ghostly body, and her limp, decapitated head rested in her lap. Her neck, a dark, ragged wound, gaped open, as though it was still crying out for its missing head. Jack's breath caught in his throat, his heart thundering in his chest. "Not again," Jack whispered to himself. The words were barely audible over the sound of his racing heart. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel tighter, trying to ignore the fact that the ghost was now so close he could almost feel the cold, ethereal presence of her. The truck jerked violently, as though the very road beneath them had come alive. Jack slammed his foot on the brakes, but the truck wouldn't stop. It slid forward, creeping along the asphalt like a slow-moving nightmare, the ghost's presence pressing down on him like an invisible weight. Her head tilted toward him, her body swaying unnaturally in the seat. The eyes of the severed head, lifeless, vacant, yet somehow alive, locked onto Jack's. Her mouth, frozen in a grimace, opened as though to speak. But there was no sound, no voice, only the sickening stillness of the truck, the cold that gripped Jack's bones. In that moment, the world outside seemed to vanish. The highway, the truck, the entire world. Everything ceased to exist except for the space between him and the headless ghost. Her presence consumed him, suffocated him. And then, with a sudden flash, everything went dark. Jack slammed on the brakes again, but the truck seemed to glide to a stop on its own. He opened his eyes, and the ghost was gone. The truck was silent. The air was thick with tension, and Jack's hands were still frozen on the wheel. His body was drenched in sweat, his breath shallow, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation. He couldn't explain what he had seen, what he had felt. All he knew was that she was still out there, still following him, still haunting him. And no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, the ghost was never far behind. The road stretched on endlessly before him, but Jack knew, deep down, that he would never be free of her. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to handle the long, lonely stretches of road. A veteran truck driver, he was used to being away from home for weeks on end, living in the isolation of his truck. But as the days wore on, as the encounters with the headless ghost continued, that isolation began to gnaw at him in a way he could not ignore. The days blurred into one another, and sleep became a distant memory. The ghost had become a constant presence, a shadow lurking in his peripheral vision, always just out of sight, but never truly gone. Jack could no longer distinguish between the real world and the nightmare that was unfolding around him. Every stretch of highway seemed like the same one, as if he was trapped in a never-ending loop, bound to encounter her again and again. His mind began to unravel. Paranoia crept in like a slow poison, suffocating him from the inside out. Everywhere he went, every stretch of road he passed, he felt her watching him. Her presence was no longer confined to the highway. No matter how fast he drove or how far he went, it seemed as though she was always just behind him, always waiting. Jack started to see her even when she wasn't there. He would glance into the side mirror and catch a glimpse of her tattered form, but when he looked again, there would be nothing. His truck began to feel like a prison. The walls of the cab, once familiar, now seemed suffocating. And the road, which had once felt like a vast expanse, felt like a trap. The endless miles seemed to stretch on forever, a distorted and twisted version of reality. At night, Jack could no longer sleep. His eyes would snap open at the slightest sound, his heart pounding in his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The headless ghost, her vacant gaze fixed on him, her body dripping with blood. Sometimes he could even hear her. The soft, eerie sound of something tapping against the truck's windows, the faintest whisper in the night, just loud enough to make his skin crawl. He would jerk awake, his heart racing, only to find that the road was empty, the truck was still, and the world outside was as silent as ever. But it didn't matter. He knew she was still out there. She was always there. James joined the group. "We have to get to the lake. The officials didn't show up." It was during one of these sleepless nights that the first strange occurrence happened. Jack had parked at a rest stop, hoping to get a few hours of rest. The sky was clear, the moon casting a pale light over the truck. As he leaned back in the seat, trying to force himself to sleep, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, on the side of his truck, were streaks. Streaks of blood, smeared across the door. It was as if someone, or something, had pressed their hand against the side of the truck, leaving a trail of crimson in its wake. Jack's hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, his breath shallow. His eyes scanned the area, but the parking lot was empty. The trucks parked beside him were silent. No one was around. He slowly opened the door, his body tense with dread. The air outside was cool, and the stillness was suffocating. But there was no one there. There was no one who could have left those marks. His stomach twisted in knots as he reached out to touch the blood. It was still warm. Shaken, Jack backed away from the truck, his eyes darting around the darkened lot. The silence was deafening. His mind raced with questions. Was it real? Was this some sort of twisted hallucination, a product of his growing insanity? Or had the ghost truly come for him, marking her presence in a way that he couldn't ignore? He tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks. The stress, the isolation, it was all taking its toll. But deep down, Jack knew better. The blood on the truck wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was her. As the days wore on, the strange occurrences only became more frequent and more intense. Jack's truck, once his sanctuary, now felt like a haunted cage. He would often hear faint, guttural noises from the back of the cab, scratching sounds, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. He would turn around, expecting to see some wild animal or a loose piece of cargo, but there was nothing, only emptiness. And yet, every time he looked, the scratching would start again, louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the noises. Jack began to see things that couldn't be explained. One evening, as he was pulling into another truck stop, he noticed something unusual. The mirrors were smeared with blood. It was subtle at first, just a faint smear across the surface. But as he wiped it away, he saw that the blood had a strange, unnatural consistency, like it had been there for days. It wasn't the kind of blood that dried and flaked away. It lingered, sticky and fresh, as though it had just been smeared across the glass. He wiped the mirrors clean, his hands shaking, but when he turned to face the rest of the truck, he froze. There, on the passenger side window, were fingerprints. Bloody, grotesque fingerprints. There were no marks on the inside of the truck, no sign of anyone having opened the door, but there, pressed against the window, was the unmistakable imprint of a hand. Its fingers long and gnarled, the blood smearing across the glass in a macabre pattern. Jack recoiled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around the parking lot, but once again there was no one, no sign of life. Only the distant hum of other trucks, and the cold, empty night. The ghost had followed him into his truck. She was inside his mind, inside his world, and nothing he did could stop it. Jack tried to fight it. He tried to convince himself that he could get away, that it was just stress, just fatigue. But the more he tried to escape, the more the ghost closed in on him. His grip on reality began to slip further. The road no longer felt like a way to freedom, but a never-ending descent into madness. The ghost was no longer just haunting the highway, she was in the very fabric of his being. And no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, Jack knew deep down that he would never escape her. She was always with him, and soon he would have to face whatever fate she had in store. The weeks since Jack first saw the headless ghost had bled into each other, his life now an endless nightmare of terror. He could no longer distinguish between day and night, sleep and wakefulness. The face of the ghost haunted every thought, every waking moment, its presence gnawing at him like a parasite, slowly devouring his sanity. It was one of those sleepless nights that pushed him over the edge. Jack had parked his truck at a remote rest stop, hoping for a few hours of rest before continuing his journey. The trucks parked around him were as still as tombstones, the parking lot eerily quiet. But Jack could not find peace. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. The sense of being watched had grown unbearable. He had learned to dread the silence, because in it, the ghost's presence was even more palpable. The tapping on his windows, the cold air, the whispers in the dark. They had all become part of his nightmarish routine. Then, in the dead of night, it happened again. The tapping started softly at first, like a distant knock. Jack stiffened, his blood running cold. He had grown used to the ghost's eerie calls, but this time something felt different. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. A chill spread through his body as he turned slowly to the passenger side window. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white with fear. And then he saw it. There, pressed against the glass, was the ghost's face. Her hollow, bloodied neck, where her head should have been. Her skin pale and torn. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to scream, to flee, but he couldn't move. It was as though he was paralyzed, trapped in the cold grip of terror. The ghost wasn't just outside his truck anymore. It was in his head, in his bones, a part of him that he couldn't escape. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just a harmless spirit, wandering the highway out of confusion or grief. This was something far worse. It was then that the truth dawned on him, something he had feared but hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge. The ghost wasn't just trying to communicate or seek peace. It was hunting him. And it would not stop until it claimed him as its next victim. As the realization washed over him, a memory surfaced in Jack's mind. It had been days since he had heard the trucker's tale at the diner, but now the pieces of the story fell into place. The headless ghost was not just a tragic soul, cursed to wander aimlessly. No, she was something far darker, a malevolent spirit driven by a singular, horrifying purpose. Her head had never been found. The story the trucker had told him, the legend of the woman killed in a horrific car accident all those years ago, now seemed like a twisted warning. The ghost's decapitation had been the result of a brutal crash on this very stretch of highway, a wreck so violent that it left her body shattered. Her head had never been recovered from the wreckage, lost somewhere along the highway in the years following the accident. That was why the ghost had been wandering, searching for her missing head, driven by an insatiable need to reunite with the part of her that had been taken from her. Jack had seen the ghost on the highway, but he had never understood the significance of the spot she had appeared in night after night. It wasn't just a random location. It was the place where she had died, the place where her head had been lost to the winds of time. That was why she had been there, lingering, unable to move on. Now, though, it wasn't just the head she was after. It was Jack. He had become a part of her hunt. The ghost's relentless pursuit of her lost head had evolved into a twisted obsession, and Jack had become the key to finding it. He was marked, cursed, drawn into the nightmare she had become. His truck was no longer a place of safety. It was a prison, and he was her next victim. Jack's breath quickened, his body trembling as the ghost's eyes bored into him. He could feel her anger radiating from her, an oppressive, suffocating force that made the air heavy with dread. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if she were trying to get in, trying to pull him into her world of torment and despair. For the first time, Jack realized that the ghost was not just a spirit. She was something far more dangerous. She was a force, a malignant entity capable of manipulating the very fabric of reality. The bloodstains on his truck, the strange occurrences, the way she seemed to appear out of nowhere. These were all signs of her power, of her hunger. The ground beneath him seemed to shake as the truck rocked violently, as though something was clawing at the sides of the vehicle. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the presence of the ghost growing stronger, encroaching on every inch of space. His mind screamed for him to flee, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. He couldn't outrun her. The horrifying truth had set in. The ghost was not a lost soul seeking redemption. She was a monster, a creature of vengeance and rage, bound by the need to find her head. and Jack was now part of that nightmare. Her cold, lifeless hand pressed against the window, leaving bloody smears on the glass. Jack watched in horror as her image began to blur, the edges of her form distorting, becoming more grotesque, more monstrous. Her mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth where there had once been nothing. The faintest whisper reached Jack's ears, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "I will find it. I will find you." It wasn't just a promise. It was a warning. Jack closed his eyes tightly, hoping to wake up from the nightmare. But when he opened them again, she was still there, pressing against the glass, her headless body now pulsating with an unnatural energy. The ghost had claimed him. And she would not stop until he was part of her gruesome collection. The truth was inescapable. Jack was now part of the ghost's twisted hunt for something that would never be found. The ghost's fury would not be sated, and neither would he. The final chapter of his life was about to unfold, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The air was thick with tension as Jack gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. The truck's engine hummed steadily beneath him, a hollow sound in the night. But the chill that had settled deep in his bones was growing more unbearable with every mile. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see the ghost lurking just behind him, watching, waiting for her moment to strike. The past few days had been a blur of terror. His sleep had become a distant memory, and every stretch of highway felt like a new chapter in his personal nightmare. The ghost had been relentless, haunting him at every turn. The sightings had grown more intense, her form more distorted and grotesque, and Jack had begun to feel like a puppet on a string, helpless and desperate, yet unable to break free of her grip. As he drove, the darkness outside seemed to close in around him, the headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the road. His thoughts swirled with the horrifying truth he had uncovered. She was no longer just a spectre. She was a force of pure vengeance, and her hunt had reached its crescendo. And he was her target. Then, as if summoned by the terror in his heart, it happened. Out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw something, a movement, a shape, a figure standing in the middle of the road. His breath caught in his throat, and his heart skipped a beat. He had seen this before, countless times, but this was different. This wasn't just a fleeting image or a nightmare. No, this was real. She was here, in front of him, her bloodied, headless form illuminated by the truck's headlights. The ghost stood perfectly still, her body as ghostly pale as ever, her neck empty, a grotesque void where her head should have been. Her tattered clothing hung loosely from her body, swaying in the cold wind that seemed to seep into the very bones of the truck. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to freeze Jack in place, his foot instinctively pressing harder on the brake. But it was too late. In that split second, everything seemed to happen at once. The ghost's empty gaze locked with Jack's, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. He could feel her malice, her insatiable hunger, clawing its way through the very air around him. Her hollow eyes bore into his soul, and in that instant, Jack understood. She wasn't just trying to kill him, she was trying to claim him, to drag him into her hellish existence. In a panic, Jack swerved violently to the left, his heart hammering in his chest, his fingers locked onto the wheel, but his hands were shaking so violently that it felt like he had lost all control. The truck lurched, tires screeching against the gravel, the rumble of the road beneath him turning into a deafening roar. His mind screamed at him to steer straight, but the wheels seemed to twist in his hands as if the ghost herself was guiding his movements. For a brief, horrifying moment, he was airborne. The truck flew off the edge of the road, the rumble of the engine now a distant memory, as everything around him spun in chaotic disarray. The world blurred into a swirling vortex of metal and darkness, and Jack felt the crushing weight of inevitability closing in. The truck slammed against the ground with a sickening thud, the impact reverberating through his entire body. The air was filled with the sound of shattering glass and the grinding screech of metal on metal. The truck flipped, twisting in a wild arc as it overturned, sending Jack into a chaotic tumble within the wreckage. His head slammed into the side of the cabin, and for a moment everything went dark. When Jack came to, the world was silent. He was lying on his back, the cold, broken pieces of his truck surrounding him like a broken shell. His vision blurred, the edges of his sight swimming in and out of focus. Pain shot through his body. His head, his arms, his chest, everything hurt. His fingers tingled, his legs were pinned, and the weight of the overturned truck pressed against his chest like an iron vice. He could hear his breath coming in ragged gasps, each inhale a struggle as he tried to push himself up. His vision cleared slightly, and in the wreckage around him, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The headlights of the truck were still on, casting a pale glow over the twisted metal, but as Jack's eyes slowly scanned the wreckage, he saw her. The ghost. The one seen before by his mother. She was standing just a few feet away, her ghostly form illuminated by the dim light of the truck. Her eyes were locked onto him, unwavering and cold, as she stepped slowly toward him. There was no more silence now. Her presence was deafening, the air thick with her anger. The blood that stained her clothing seemed to glow in the dim light, a dark, sinister hue that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand on end. Jack's heart pounded and panic surged through his veins. He tried to move, to scream, but his body was frozen, the weight of his injuries keeping him trapped in place. His arms were useless, limp at his sides. His legs felt like they were burning with agony, the pressure of the truck pinning him further into the dirt. The ghost was closing in, her form growing more solid, more tangible with each step. Her mouth opened, revealing jagged, broken teeth, though she had no head. Her hollow neck seemed to swell with an unnatural energy, as though something inside her was reaching out, calling to Jack. "I've waited," she whispered, though her mouth never moved. The sound seemed to vibrate in his very bones, sending shivers down his spine. "For so long. And now you're mine." Jack's breath came in desperate, gasping sobs. He could feel the blood rushing to his head, his vision clouding with the haze of pain and terror. He tried to move again, but it was futile. The ghost was so close now that he could feel the cold emanating from her, chilling him to the core. He was trapped, and there was no escaping her. The truck's twisted frame groaned as though the very earth was swallowing him whole. But it was the ghost that held him in her grip, her malevolent energy seeping into him, filling him with dread and despair. Her headless body hovered over him, its shadow stretching far beyond the wreckage. Jack closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. He had no fight left in him. His only hope now was that somehow, by some miracle, this would all end. But deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. The ghost's cold touch grazed his arm, and in that moment, Jack's world went completely dark. V1. The world was spinning. Jack's vision flickered in and out of focus, his body a mass of pain and broken bones. The overwhelming weight of the wreckage pressed down on him like an unyielding force. the twisted metal of the truck's cabin digging into his chest, making each breath a battle he was losing. His limbs were pinned in place, immobile, and he could feel the blood pooling around him, thick and warm, yet his body felt cold, numb with fear. Time was no longer a comfortable ally. The seconds dragged, stretching into an eternity as Jack lay helpless beneath the wreckage. The faint glow of the truck's headlights illuminated the chaos around him, the crumpled steel, the scattered debris, the shattered glass. But it was not just the truck that was illuminated. A soft, unnatural light began to fill the air, casting eerie shadows over the wreckage. Jack's heart thudded painfully in his chest, a raw pulse of terror. He could see it, hovering just beyond the edge of his vision. The ghost. She had come for him. Her body glowed with an otherworldly light, her pale, bloodied form flickering like a dying flame. The light that surrounded her was not warm or inviting, but cold, an icy radiance that seemed to distort the very air around her. The edges of her figure shimmered as though she were made of mist, her blood-stained rags fluttering without a breath of wind. The tattered remnants of her clothing fluttered around her form, the stains of her past evident even in the pale light. Her presence was suffocating, filling the wreckage with a coldness that reached deep into Jack's bones. He could feel her eyes on him, those empty sockets where her head should have been. The space where her neck ended in an open, gaping void was enough to paralyze him. His breath caught in his throat, and the familiar dread crawled up his spine, thick and suffocating. She had been waiting for him, and now there was no escaping. "I'm ready. Let's go down." Her form flickered in and out of existence, her body distorted in ways that defied nature. It was as though she was not fully present in the world, her presence twisted and fractured, a ghostly reflection of something that had been torn apart by tragedy. Jack's heart raced as the ghost slowly moved toward him, floating just above the ground. She was not walking. She was gliding, an ethereal floating thing that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. "I've waited so long." The voice, though lacking a mouth, echoed through Jack's mind, reverberating like 1,000 whispers in the back of his skull. It wasn't spoken. It was felt. The words penetrated deep into his mind, freezing him in place. "I've been looking for you. Looking for someone to join me." Jack tried to scream, but no sound came. His voice was trapped in his throat, his body paralyzed by both pain and terror. The ghost drifted closer, her chilling presence suffocating, pulling at his very soul. She hovered just inches from his face, and he could feel the intense cold radiating off her, as if the air around her was freezing to the point of death. The stench of decay filled his nostrils, a rotting metallic odor that made his stomach churn, but there was no escaping it. The ghost raised one of her arms, her thin, skeletal fingers reaching for him, and as they brushed against his skin, a cold, numbing sensation spread through him. He could feel the chill of her touch, the icy fingers like daggers of frost piercing through his body, as if she were reaching for something deep inside him. His chest tightened, and the panic that had been building inside him finally broke free in a silent scream. But it wasn't the end. No, Jack realized with growing dread that this was just the beginning. The ghost had not come to kill him. She had come to claim him. Where and when had these women conquered so much? Her presence was more than death. It was an invitation to join her in whatever dark void lay beyond the living world. The horror of the moment hit him like a physical blow, and he could feel his mind slipping into a haze of terror. The weight of inevitability hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him, and Jack knew that he had no escape. No way out. "I never found it," the ghost whispered, the voice like a cold breath across his ear, though she had no mouth. "My head. I've been searching for so long, but now I can have you. Your soul, your life. You will be the last piece I need." The air around them thickened, and the light surrounding the ghost intensified, growing so bright that Jack could no longer keep his eyes open. His vision blurred, and a sharp pain lanced through his skull as he tried to shield himself from the light. But it was useless. It enveloped him, swallowing him whole. Jack's heart raced as the reality of the situation sank in. The truck, the crash, the nightmare. It was all leading to this. There would be no rescue, no miraculous survival. The ghost had found her final victim. And that victim was him. The world around him seemed to shudder and warp. The wreckage of the truck faded into the distance, the cold, glowing presence of the ghost becoming all-consuming. There was no road left to run, no hope of escape. All that remained was the dark, eternal void that stretched out before him, the silence of death closing in, and the sickening certainty that his time had come. With a final, soft whisper, the ghost's presence seemed to swallow him whole. The last thing Jack felt was the cold touch of her fingers against his skin, sending a wave of icy numbness throughout his body, before everything turned black. And then, there was nothing. Friends, this story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. The locations, characters, and events depicted are not real. Any resemblance to actual places, persons, or events is purely coincidental. The intent of this story is not to offend anyone's sentiments or promote superstition. Please regard it as a work of fiction. If you enjoyed this story and want more thrilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more spine-chilling content.